Since producing our first ABC of Southern Railway locomotives over 50 years ago, the publishing company, which emanated from that first modest publication, has produced and distributed over 100 million copies of books and magazines on transport subjects. And to this we're adding an ever-increasing number of video programs. This is the third in a series of 4 programs outlining the history of British railways, illustrated by a fascinating variety of archive film from the 1930s to the 70s, together with contemporary scenes and working reproductions of the early days.
To many people, the Great Western Railway was the holiday line. In the year 1935, what is perhaps the best-known holiday express of all, the Cornish Riviera, was re-equipped with a new style of carriage, the so-called centenary stock. In their magnificent chocolate and cream paint scheme, these were the widest and most luxurious coaches seen to that time on the Great Western. Headed by an equally splendid King-class locomotive, the train is seen entering the railway's great London terminus at Paddington. The centenary stock was so named as its introduction was to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the foundation of the Great Western Railway in 1835. 5 years after the famous Liverpool and Manchester Railway had opened, royal assent was given on the 31st of August 1835 to an Act of Parliament for the construction of a railway from London via Reading and the Thames Valley to Bath and Bristol. As with most early railways, the Great Western was founded by merchants at the country end of the railway, the objective in this case being to form a link from the great port of Bristol to London. The directors chose a local engineer, already famous as the engineer to the docks and the designer of the Clifton Suspension Bridge, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He surveyed the line for the railway and organised its construction. Brunel was a man of vision. He rejected a previous proposal to build a line by way of towns such as Newbury and Trowbridge in favour of a direct line through the Thames Valley. He also envisaged high-speed running and laid out the main line with easy curves and minimal gradients. He also promoted the idea of the broad gauge, a magnificent concept, but one which was to make the Great Western incompatible with other railways. It opened throughout in 1841. The first part of the line to open was from Paddington to Maidenhead in 1838. This marked the start of a period of growth for that town and for others such as Southall and Slough, which was served by the new railway. However, the Great Western was always a long-distance railway and did not build up a great network of branches in the London area, although towns such as Windsor, Henley-upon-Thames, Marlow and Uxbridge were later connected to the original main line. Suburban commuter services built up on the main line and branches, the principal services being in the hands of specially designed tank engines such as the county tanks of Churchwood and the metropolitan tanks of William Dean at the time of the centenary. These services were relatively long-haul by comparison with many other railways, and most of their running was along the main line. Locomotive and stock depots were provided alongside the main line at Southall to cater for the commuter services, and the original double-track main line was extended to a 4-track layout, this gradually being added to until it reached Didcot, the junction for the Great Western's main line branch to Oxford, a railway included in the original prospectus as one of 3 planned from the outset. The ancient university city was a natural railway objective. However, the first station for Oxford was at Steventon on the main line, as the city did not seem to want the railway. The GWR's original proposal for a branch was opposed by Christchurch College and was not built. Eventually, in 1844, a local company, the Oxford Railway, absorbed by the GWR before opening, reached the western side of the city. The first station only lasted a matter of 8 years. A new station was built at the time that the railway was extended to Birmingham via Leamington Spa. It became a railway crossroads as traffic to the west at Worcester and beyond developed, and after the broad gauge was abolished, it became a transfer point for trains from the railways of the south, as through trains from places such as Bournemouth, Portsmouth and Brighton passed through Oxford. Here, southern locomotives would give way to Great Western ones for the remainder of their journey north. The Great Western's characteristic signals are visible in these scenes. The signals were always lower quadrant and of a quite distinctive shape, unlike those of any other railway. The cosmopolitan aspect of the railway here is seen as the Great Western engine takes the train from the southern to the north, including coaches from the LNER. Another cross-country train enters from the north. Oxford's development as a railway crossroads was helped by the arrival of a branch from the LNWR's main line at Bletchley. In the 1930s, the Great Western pioneered diesel railcars for use on lightly loaded cross-country services, which it used in the Oxford area for commuter branches and for longer distance services over lines such as the Cotswolds line to Worcester. This railway, opened fully in 1854, was a product of the railway mania of 1845, when it was promoted as the Oxford, Worcester and Wolverhampton Railway, with the intention of connecting the Great Western to the Black Country and to break the London and Birmingham Railway's monopoly of that traffic. The OWW was engineered by Brunel, who for once got his sums wrong. The railway cost 2.5 times his estimate to build, which led to major problems as the whole of the route had been started at once and no part could be completed to start the generation of income. After a protracted struggle, it was eventually completed as far as Evesham in 1852 and throughout in 1854. Such was the poor quality of the railway that it earned itself the nickname of the Old Worse and Worse. The Old Worse and Worse took the Great Western into the territory of the West Midlands. One of the major towns it served was Kidderminster, famous for its carpet trade. Expansion in the area included a cross-country line along the River Severn Valley to Shrewsbury, known as the Severn Valley. Kidderminster itself became a busy suburban commuter station, whilst the Severn Valley line was to become, in the 1970s, a true holiday line. The principal preserved railway to feature Great Western Railway practices. These views show the railway around Bewdley, a popular town on the banks of the River Severn, and today the headquarters of the Severn Valley Railway. Preserved railways have become a major part of the holiday and leisure industry, as well as being museum pieces preserving the railway heritage. Lines such as the Severn Valley can give demonstrations of how railways were worked in the age of steam, as well as keeping alive the memories of the great railways. aspect of the Great Western that is remembered by many people in the industrial Midlands is the running of special holiday excursion trains to the West Country. Summer Saturdays in the West Country are part of the childhood of those whose annual holidays meant a visit to the seaside, and such was their popularity that the Great Western had to use every available locomotive, including freight engines. Preserved railways also have examples of the engines that kept the wheels turning for those same holidaymakers when they returned to work. Many commuter lines were worked by the characteristic Great Western pannier tanks. The image most people have of the Great Western is that of the locomotives. Painted in the deep Brunswick green livery with copper-capped chimneys and brass safety valve covers, they maintained the family look and contributed in a large part to the Great Western's favourable public image. Railway preservation has itself become part of the history of Britain's railways. No other country in the world has developed preservation to such an extent, and in the early 1990s, there was at least one steam excursion on the public railway network every week. Many of these commemorate historic events. In 1993, one of the Great Western's principal express passenger engines, a member of the famous Castle class, was used to celebrate the anniversary of the birth of the great engineer of the Great Western, Brunel. This was a fine example of the way preservation covers different aspects of our railway history. As we've already heard, Brunel was the engineer for the original Great Western, being appointed to that post when he was only 27 years old. Both were individualistic, Brunel forcing much of his character onto the railway, most notably by his use of a track gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, which made the Great Western unique, but incompatible with any other railway. Through the Victorian era, the giants of the broad gauge strode along the Great Western rails, but hard reality ensured that the railway would have to conform, and in 1892, the last broad gauge trains ran, and the Great Western conformed. Synonymous with the name of the railway is Swindon. Here were the railway's great workshops, where locomotives were built or came to die, as did the broad gauge engines. Soon, new engines built in the Victorian tradition emerged. However, within 10 years, it was breaking new ground again, as another great engineer, George Jackson Churchward, set about building a fleet of locomotives which, by the application of the principles of standardisation, were to be ahead of all other railways. And with the continuity of policy which characterised Churchward and his successors, helped to keep the Great Western Railway different. For a while, Great Western locomotives were a curious mixture of ancient and modern, as the Churchwood principles were combined with the technology of the previous age, and Victorian and 20th century locomotives ran together. No other railway was like the Great Western. It had a following amongst the railway fraternity and the general public, which no other railway was able to emulate. It dominated the southwest of England, a far cry from its only rival there, the London and South Western. It linked London to the great port of Bristol, and it served to link South Wales to the capital. Its tentacles spread out to the west in all meanings of the word, including through the West Midlands to the banks of the River Mersey. Although in truth it had no monopoly in any area, there were always other companies trying to take a share of its markets, it usually seemed to be the most important railway wherever it had railways and stations. If there was one area in which it did not have the upper hand, it was the West Midlands. The Great Western's main line to Birmingham was opened as late as 1852 and was a mixed gauge line. The London and North Western and the Midland Railways were already well established in the area, but the Great Western's line was designed as part of a trunk line intended to take the broad gauge to the Mersey. Unfortunately, this line, the Birmingham and Oxford, was too late for that purpose, and was constructed with mixed gauge, becoming narrow gauge only from 1869. This is Leamington Spa Station in the 1930s, whilst being rebuilt. This was effectively the terminus of the Great Western suburban system for the southeast Birmingham area. The railway built up a substantial business with commuter traffic in the south and west parts of the city. Freight was also heavy, and the station had 2 through lines bypassing the platforms to allow the freights and the expresses to Birmingham and Birkenhead to overtake the local trains. Whilst the holiday expresses seen at Leamington Spa were heading for the Southern Railway's South Coast resorts, the resorts in the southwest of England, in Devon and Cornwall, were served first and foremost by the Great Western. The holiday resorts of the English Riviera owe their growth and prosperity to the Great Western and its forebears, which opened them up to the holidaymakers from both London and the industrial heartland of the Midlands. The first mainline railway to be promoted in the West Country was the Bristol and Exeter. It was built concurrently with the Great Western and actually opened to Bristol on the 30th of June 1841, on the same day as the Great Western. The South Devon from Exeter to Plymouth and the Cornwall Railway to Truro and Falmouth followed. All were engineered by Brunel and built to the broad gauge. His final triumph was the Royal Albert Bridge, linking Devon and Cornwall. Having seen it completed in 1859, he died at the early age of 54. Cornwall's first railways had been industrial, as in many other parts of the country. Branches were promoted from the 1840s to service the expanding industry of china clay extraction. This had started in the 18th century, but had not expanded until, in 1842, J. Treffry opened a horse-drawn tramway to service the Luxonian Valley, where the main clay mines were situated. A similar line opened to Newquay in 1849. With the opening up of Cornwall by railways, Plymouth, the great naval base and the largest centre of population in South Devon, assumed even greater importance. It has remained the principal railway centre in the West Country, seeing the various changes in the railway scene. The Great Western Railway gave way to the Western Region of British Railways in 1948, but kept the individuality of the Great Western. From Brunel's day, the West Country had had different railways. The South Devon Main Line was built with very severe gradients as a result of Brunel's experimentation with what was known as atmospheric traction, whereby a train was propelled by the use of a vacuum in a pipe laid between the lines. Sadly, it was beyond the reach of Victorian technology and was replaced with steam locomotives. Once the atmospheric railway system had been abandoned, the Great Western was faced with railways in South Devon with exceptionally severe gradients. This led to frequent double-heading and banking, and therefore expensive working costs. The West Country was thus an early candidate for the elimination of steam, which took place from the late 1950s onwards as diesel traction was introduced. The Western's diesels were as individualistic as the railway had been. Whilst other regions of British Railways ordered diesel-electric machines, the Western region ordered diesel hydraulics, although it did make use of the standard diesel-electric shounters at locations such as Foy for the China clay traffic. The hydraulics were not only different mechanically but physically. The warship, Western, High-Neck and North British Type 2 machines were built from the late 1950s onwards and were used on both passenger and freight work throughout the Western system. In the late 1960s, British Rail decided to standardise on diesel-electric traction, which meant that the hydraulics became non-standard and liable to early withdrawal themselves. All were eliminated during the 1970s, but a number were rescued for preservation, becoming the first modern machines to be preserved in any numbers. In the West Country, the Westerns and warships were replaced by English electric diesels of Class 50, themselves displaced from the West Coast main line north of Crewe, when this was electrified. This process was known as cascading, and the Class 50s were again to be cascaded to the former Southern Region's main line to Exeter, which we will see later. On the Western mainline trains themselves, the Class 50s were replaced by HSTs, or high-speed trains, with which they had worked for some time. By the end of the 1980s, all Western expresses were formed of these train sets. Freight traffic, never heavy in the West Country, continued to contract, and by the early 1990s, the only originating traffic beyond Exeter was the China clay business, with just a few oil and cement workings. Local passenger workings were taken over by sprinter units, including the single-car Class 153 units, and almost all traces of the Great Western's individuality had gone. However, Brunel's legacies of steep gradients in the West Country and a billiard-smooth main line through the Thames Valley remain. We'll now go back to those early days to examine the other railway systems in the south of England. In the north part of Kent, the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway was the first public steam-operated railway in southern England, opened in 1830. The south was host to the world's first public railway, the Surrey Iron Railway, authorised in 1801, but it was really a tramway operated by horses, and was abandoned as early as 1846. The Canterbury and Whitstable lasted until 1953, having been taken over by the South Eastern Railway, one of the two competing railways that created a very intense railway system throughout Kent. This period of rivalry was known as the Feud, and lasted from 1861 to 1899, when the two railways came together to operate as one under a managing committee. This long and ultimately futile period had its genesis in the origins of the South Eastern Railway. By 1837, three main trunk routes had been promoted in the south of England, to Southampton, Brighton and Dover. These would form the backbones of the three railway companies which would come together in 1923 to create the Southern Railway. Parliament was of the opinion that only one approach to London from the south and southeast was necessary, so the lines to Brighton and Dover were to share their route as far as Croydon. This was amended within a year to a junction at what was later to become Redhill. South Eastern Railway's main line struck off due east from Redhill, passing through the towns of Edenbridge, Tunbridge, Headcorn and Ashford on a straight alignment, before turning southeast to Folkestone and Dover, reached along the seashore under the famous White Cliffs. It opened in 1844 to Dover Town Station. In the same year, it was authorised to build a branch to Margate on the East Kent coast, which was opened, serving Canterbury on the route from Ashford in 1846. It was a very roundabout route. In 1853, a bill was presented by an independent group of landowners, and as the East Kent Railway, it opened in 1858 from Strood to Faversham. It had running powers over the South Eastern's line from London Bridge to Strood, the North Kent line. The South Eastern had seen the newcomer as a purely local line, but the contractors had other ideas. In 1855, they obtained powers to extend their line to Dover, and then 3 years later applied to build a line from the North Kent to another existing railway, the West End of London and Crystal Palace Railway. The South Eastern opposed this, saying the North Kent was already fully utilised. As a result, the East Kent was able to promote a fully independent line from Strood, and in 1860 changed its name to the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. Thus was born the feud, as from the Chatham's opening in 1863, the railways battled for the lucrative cross-channel traffic from Dover. These scenes were filmed in the 1930s and 50s at Dover Marine, the station built by the managing committee after the feud ended in 1899. This was to become the main station for the Southern Railway's cross-channel traffic, supplemented by the South Eastern's other ferry terminal at Folkestone Harbour. Very visible features of the South Eastern were its coaching stock, with the so-called birdcage brake coaches, and the locomotives with their pagoda-style cab roofs. This is one of the smallest locomotives of the railway, a Class P tank engine seen at work today on one of the last railways to be built in Kent, the Kent and East Sussex. Despite the myriad of lines built by the feuding partners, the ancient Sackport town of Tenterden had been bypassed. So, in 1903, a small railway authorised under the provisions of the Light Railways Act of 1896 was opened from Robertsbridge on the South Eastern's Tunbridge to Hastings main line. The Light Railways Act had been passed to permit the building of rural railways to less stringent standards than had existed before its creation. The provisions enabled the railway to have less bridges by using level crossings, lighter trackwork and smaller stations, and allowed mixed passenger and freight trains. However, speeds were limited and only small light locomotives could be used. The Kent and East Sussex led an impecunious existence, becoming part of a run-down railway empire presided over by the well-known Colonel Holman F. Stevens, who had his headquarters at Tenterden. The light railway era was too late in the day, as before the railways had really had time to consolidate their position, the First World War brought social changes to the country and promoted the availability of cheap road transport. The Colonel Stevens empire struggled on, providing a less and less needed service, with only a few lines surviving into British Railways days. The Kent and East Sussex was one of these, and this contributed to its eventual preservation. Today it recreates those days using vintage locomotives and stock. Another locomotive of the same type, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway Terrier, or A1X class, is seen on the Isle of Wight Preserved Railway. These little engines, when they became surplus on their native system, were sold to many small railways, including the Kent and East Sussex and a number of the railways of the Isle of Wight. This large island off the coast of Hampshire had a self-contained railway system, a microcosm of the railways of the mainland. There were 6 independent railways here in the Victorian era, plus a joint London and South Western and London, Brighton and South Coast railway line. In total, the system had only 45.25 route miles. 5 of the independent railways served the island's capital, Newport, at which we see the heterogeneous collection of locomotives bequeathed to the Southern Railway by the island's railways, together with the former LSWR Class 02-044 tanks, which the Southern had transferred to the island in the 1920s and 30s. The first railway on the island was the Cowes and Newport Railway, opened in 1862. This linked what were then the 2 largest towns on the island, Cowes being the traditional port for the steam packets to Southampton, situated on the tidal River Medina. Newport and the neighbouring parish of Carisbrooke had the largest population and a number of industries, including brewing and an iron foundry. The second railway was the Isle of Wight Railway, which opened from Ryde on the eastern end of the island opposite Portsmouth to Ventnor on the south coast in 1866. A branch was opened in 1882 to Benbridge from Brading, at which we see the last example of the earliest standard type of locomotive used by the island's railways, a Bayer Peacock 240 tank. When the railways were merged into the Southern Railway in 1923, the total locomotive stock from all the railways was 18. By that time, there were 3 railways, the Isle of Wight Railway, the Freshwater, Yarmouth and Newport serving the west end of the island, and the Isle of Wight Central, an amalgamation of the original Cowes and Newport, with a railway from Newport to Sandown, and the Ryde and Newport Railway, a portion of which is the preserved railway today. The joint LSWR and LBSCR line was built from Ryde to St John's Road Station under the promenade and onto the pier to serve the steam packets to Portsmouth. Both the Isle of Wight and Isle of Wight Central had running rights onto the pier, which had been built alongside the original pier, owned by an independent company which ran a tram service along it. Today, the only trains which run on the island are electric units from the pier to Shanklin, and the steam railway. We'll now return to the mainland by steamer, to Portsmouth Harbour Station, where an LSWR Paddlebox 460 locomotive awaits us. Portsmouth Harbour was another LSWR and LBSCR joint station, and it is the history of the latter to which we will now turn. The LBSCR, or London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, to give it its full title, was the last of the 3 great trunk lines authorised by 1837 to serve the south. The railway to Brighton opened throughout in 1841. The Brighton Main Line was possibly the first long-distance commuter railway of all, and alone sums up the title of this programme. Brighton itself was a very fashionable resort even before the coming of the railway, but right from the start the company went out of its way to encourage traffic to the City of London. From its opening, there was an express calling at Croydon only, which took an hour and 3/4 on the 51-mile journey, arriving at London Bridge Station at 10:15 a.m, having left Brighton at 8:30 a.m. These scenes were filmed nearly a century later, in 1933, on the occasion of the final run of the steam-hauled Southern Belle Pullman Express, the spiritual successor of the 8:30. The next day, it was to give way to the most famous Brighton train of all, the electric Brighton Belle. The LBSCR was probably the most celebrated user of Pullman coaches, the British subsidiary of the Great American Pullman Car Company running its own coaches in the trains of British railway companies. The name Pullman came to symbolise luxury throughout the world, and in Britain, the chocolate and cream coaches were to survive until the end of steam on the former Southern Railway, and into the 1970s on the Brighton line. The Brighton was to expand to many parts of southern England, dominating Sussex and reaching into East Hampshire and West Kent. It built lines along the south coast from Hastings to Portsmouth, and had a number of secondary main lines and cross-country routes through the Surrey suburbs to the coast. It built up an extensive suburban system and was instrumental in the rapid growth of the commuter belt throughout its area. It was a pioneer of electrification, the first electrified line in the south being the Brighton's London Victoria to London Bridge service, commencing in 1909. However, the overhead system used by the Brighton was not adopted by the Southern Railway. Mainline electrification to Brighton was on the third rail principle, as was all subsequent electrification in the south. With its relatively short runs, the Brighton had less use than other lines for tandem locomotives, and built a large fleet of tank engines for both passenger and freight use, together with a smaller fleet of tender engines. These appeared on all its lines, including the rural lines of East Sussex. It had a subsidiary system of lines providing through routes to the coast based on Oxted, which was positioned in a gap in the North Downs. These lines did not prosper as much as the main lines, and in 1958, British Railways closed one of the best known of them all, the East Grinstead to Lewes Bluebell line. This led a group of schoolboys to form a preservation society, and in 1960 it was the first ex-British Railways line to reopen as a preserved railway. The pioneering success of the Bluebell Railway led to a number of other schemes throughout the country and to the modern railway preservation movement. Today, other railways recreate the history and atmosphere of the Southern Railway and its constituents in different parts of the south, including the Midhants Watercress line from Alresford to Alton. This was once an LSWR cross-country line. These locomotives are turn-of-the-century engines of classes M7 and T9, built to the designs of the great Scottish engineer Dugald Drummond. He brought his distinctive Scottish style to the south of England virtually unchanged, setting a tradition of worthy engineering that was to continue into Southern Railway days. This locomotive is the sole working survivor of that Scottish school of engineering, and is owned by the National Railway Museum at York. It is seen working on another preserved southern line, the Swanage branch, on the Isle of Purbeck. Although Drummond brought conventional engineering to the south, the last great steam locomotive engineer for the Southern Railway was Oliver Bullitt, a very unconventional engineer. The locomotives built to his designs were the most radical ever produced in quantity in Great Britain, and were the final flowering of southern steam. The story of the Bullitt Pacifics is very much involved with the story of the Southern Railway's train services to the holidaymaker and the commuter. It goes back to the origins of the final main line in the south, the London and South Western Railway. The genesis of the LSWR was the first of the main lines to be authorised and the first to open, the London and Southampton Railway. This great trunk route, the longest in the south of England, was opened throughout in 1840. At first it served London by a terminus on the outskirts of the city at Nine Elms, but in 1848 it was extended to a new site on the south bank of the River Thames, where it built its new Waterloo terminus. The railway traversed the flat Surrey and North Hampshire countryside as far as Basingstoke, where it struck southwest towards its ultimate goal, Southampton, through the chalk hills of mid-Hampshire. It approached the county town Winchester through a series of deep cuttings in the chalk, engineered by the great Joseph Locke. The effect on the district was immediate. Southampton, a small port when the railway opened, became one of the country's major seaports. The expansion of the docks area being a part of the London and South Western's expansion. The London and Southampton had become the LSWR in 1842, when it promoted the first of its feeder lines, a branch from the peaceful village of Bishopstoke to Gosport, to serve Portsmouth by a ferry link. Bishopstoke was to spawn a new community by the side of the railway junction, which became even more important in 1825, when a branch to Salisbury opened. The new community was named Eastleigh. Further branches followed, including a line over the hills to the east of Winchester to Alton, known as the Mid-Hants line. Portsmouth was to be given a direct route in 1859, when the LSWR took over a railway built by Thomas Brassey, a well-known contractor. Salisbury got a direct line 2 years earlier, in 1857. The first part of the Portsmouth direct route to Guildford had come in 1845, the same year as the indirect line to Salisbury had opened. Further links followed, including a new Guildford line via Cobham from Esher. The South Western was building a network of lines in the southwestern suburbs of London, and its expansion was to create the vast outer suburban sprawl of Surrey and North Hampshire. The site of the first junction at Eastleigh was to become famous in later years when the railway established its locomotive and carriage works in the town. Opened at the beginning of the 20th century, this was the genesis of one of the South's most successful towns. The South Western was responsible for the development of a number of towns. As we've seen, it promoted the growth of the suburbs through the provision of many lines and their associated commuter trains. It was instrumental in the development of Southampton docks, and it also helped to create a number of holiday resorts, not the least of which was Bournemouth. Although it was the arrival of the railway that created Bournemouth, the South Western at first seemed reluctant to participate. Its original main line extension from Southampton had wound its way around the northern part of the New Forest via Ringwood and Wimborne on its way to Dorchester. Known as Castleman's Corkscrew, this railway was opened in 1847. At this time, Bournemouth was a hamlet of less than 30 houses, dwarfed by its neighbour Poole, a small port on the edge of one of the world's largest natural harbours. The Corkscrew promoted a short branch to Hanworthy, adjacent to Poole. However, Victorian entrepreneurs saw the potential of the small hamlet which was to become Bournemouth and actively promoted it. In the South Western's usual style, an indirect railway was built towards the fledgling town, down the Avon Valley, from Ringwood to Christchurch and through to Bournemouth, opening in 1870. From the western end, another branch approached the town from Broadstone, opening to Bournemouth West Station in 1874. Not until 1888 were the two railways linked, and a new central station built. Bournemouth's phenomenal growth stems from the arrival of the through railway. It had started to grow by mid-century, and by the time of the opening of the central station and a new direct line across the New Forest, it had around 25,000 inhabitants. This rose to 80,000 by the First World War and 120,000 in the mid-1930s. The original Bournemouth West Station, seen here in the 30s, became the terminus for the main expresses from Waterloo, with portions carrying on to Weymouth. The fastest of them all was the Bournemouth Limited, a non-stop train to Waterloo taking 2 hours over the journey, and a measure of the importance of Bournemouth to the Southern Railway, the South Western's successor. But the Southern didn't have it all its own way at Bournemouth. In the 1860s, 2 local cross-country railways had been built to link the English Channel to the Bristol Channel. Known as the Dorset Central and the Somerset Central Railways, they ran from a junction with the LSWR at Wimborne across their namesake counties to Burnham-on-Sea near Bridgewater. In 1862, they amalgamated to form the Somerset and Dorset Railway, but crossing agricultural land with few major towns, the new concern was soon in deep financial trouble. In 1866, a receiver was appointed, a situation which lasted 4 years. In an effort to obtain worthwhile traffic, the railway engaged upon a major expansion and built a new line from Evercreech in rural Somerset over the Mendic Hills through Radstock to Bath, where it met the Midland Railway and shared that line's terminus at Bath Green Park. The Somerset and Dorset could now enjoy mineral traffic from the coalfields around Radstock and through passenger traffic from the north via the Midland Railway to Bournemouth. But the financial strain was again too great, and in 1875 the London and South Western Railway and the Midland Railway took the Somerset and Dorset over on a 999-year lease. The Midland undertook to provide locomotives, producing its largest design, except for the solitary Licky Banker, to work the S&D. The railway had severe gradients and needed heavy locomotives to work it. In its last years, under British Railways, the nationalised railway's largest class of steam locomotive, the Class 9F freight engines, were used on Somerset and Dorset passenger trains. Today it's but a memory, closed in 1966 following the Beeching Report and its transfer to the Western region. Whilst the Somerset and Dorset crossed from north to south, the LSWR had promoted an east-to-west main line to the West Country. The two met at Templecombe, where traffic was exchanged. The LSWR's West of England line was conceived and built as a main line, the immediate goal being Exeter. But it also had its sights set on a line throughout to the furthest tip of Cornwall, as a rival to the Great Western. The main line from Salisbury to Exeter was built in 2 sections, to the east and west of Yeovil. It opened throughout in 1860 as a single line. It was doubled 10 years later. This was the holiday line par excellence. Branches were built to the south coast to small resorts such as Seaton, Lyme Regis, Sidmouth and Exmouth. And to serve these, the LSWR and later the Southern Railway ran multi-portioned trains with through carriages from Waterloo. In the summer, every train seemed to be called the Atlantic Coast Express, the name of the 11 a.m. train to the West Country, which during the holiday times was expanded into complete trains for each of the small resorts. The hub of the West Country system was Exeter Central, where trains were forever being marshalled and remarshalled. However, beyond here, the LSWR seemed to lose its purpose. This was where it met the Great Western, and the battleground for the holiday traffic began. As we've seen, The Great Western Empire included the South Devon Railway, which acquired the monopoly of the English Riviera resorts such as Teignmouth, Torquay and Paignton. It also had the direct route around the southern edge of Dartmoor to Plymouth. The LSWR had to be content with reaching the West Country's Great Port by a circuitous route around the north of Dartmoor, serving only Okehampton and Tavistock of any note. Access to Plymouth was via a subsidiary company, the Plymouth, Devonport and South Western Junction, and utilised running powers over the Great Western's main line in the city. The PDSWJR also built a branch line into Cornwall to Callington, which it operated independently, its main line being worked by the South Western. Today, this is one of the few survivors of the West Country branches of the Southern Railway, of which it became part, like the LSWR, in 1923. The LSWR's system of cross-country railways and branches beyond Exeter was colloquially known as the Withered Arm, due to its appearance on the map. Whilst serving many small coastal resorts and West Country towns, it seemed to be a collection of minor lines with no great strategic value. Small locomotives and short trains were the general rule on the Withered Arm. But as we've described already, the South Western, when approaching Exeter, had its eyes on a through main line to Cornwall. At that time, the West Cornwall Railway from Truro to Penzance, opened from 1852 to 1855, was narrow gauge and incompatible with the Great Western's Cornish ally, the Cornwall Railway. One of the earliest lines in the Duchy of Cornwall was the Bodmin and Wadebridge Railway. It had opened in 1834, and as early as 1845, the LSWR had bought it, with the intention of linking it to the West Cornwall Railway and to its proposed main line from Exeter. This, however, was the Railway Mania year, and the LSWR took another 15 years to reach Exeter, by which time it was too late. The West Cornwall became broad gauge in 1864, and the Bodmin and Wadebridge remained isolated from the LSWR until that railway reached Wadebridge with its North Cornwall line in 1895. This is one of the legendary BT well tents, which worked the railway until the early 1960s. They provide a link with the final part of our programme, as they were the LSWR's first purpose-built suburban tank engines, used on the London commuter services before their eventual transfer to the West Country. The LSWR was the second Southern Railway to invest in electrification for its suburban services. Unlike the Brighton, it utilised an additional rail, known as the third rail, to provide the DC electric current. It opened its first suburban electrified services on the Kingston roundabout route during the First World War, and laid the foundations of the great suburban system to be known as the Southern Electric. Upon its formation in 1923, the Southern decided to standardise on the LSWR's third rail system for future electrification and to abandon the Brighton's overhead system. The electrification became the railway's principal criterion. Throughout the 1920s, it applied the system to its suburban branches, becoming in the process the largest electrified suburban system of its time. The process included the electrification of the local lines running alongside the main through lines, the LSWR main line becoming 4-track as far as Basingstoke. It was electrified on the local lines only to just beyond Woking, at the junction for the Alton line, one of the outer suburban lines to be electrified in the 1930s. One further addition to the suburban system was opened by the Southern, although the plans were inherited from its constituents. This was the line from Wimbledon to Mitcham Junction to give a connection between the LSWR lines and the Brighton lines. This latecomer was always an oddity amongst suburban lines, being single track, but it was electrified and still provides a useful service today. In the 1930s, the Southern embarked upon mainline electrification. The first was the Brighton main line, followed by a number of cross-country ones. In 1935, the South Eastern main lines to Sevenoaks were dealt with, whilst 1937 saw the first main line electrification on LSWR lines to Portsmouth. After the war, the Southern introduced 3 electric locomotives to the design of Oliver Bullitt, intended for boat train and mixed traffic duties. The Southern had declared its intention to electrify all its services and had thus restricted the amount of money available for locomotive development. It was this and the financial restraints of the economic depression of the 1930s, followed by the war, that enabled Bullitt to make a case for the production of his controversial Pacifics, in order to update the railway's steam locomotive fleet, pending the resumption of mainline electrification schemes. The LSWR's adoption of the third rail DC system had been partly a requirement to achieve compatibility with the first suburban electrified railways in London, which were later to form the London Underground system. The first of these included the District Railway, which shared lines with the LSWR in the Richmond area. The Underground railways used 600 volts DC and a 4-rail current collection system. The District and Metropolitan Railways continued to operate steam locomotives over their electric system, and in the early days ran normal trains with electric locomotives. One of the Metropolitan electric locomotives, Sarah Siddons, is preserved and works today. British Railways continued the Southern's electrification plans, culminating in the Bournemouth electrification scheme inaugurated in 1967. This saw the end of steam working on the former Southern Region lines. For some time, diesel locomotives worked the main line beyond Bournemouth to Weymouth, but in the late 1980s that was also electrified and stylish modern electric units were introduced, known as the Wessex Electrics. Outer suburban electric trains today give an efficient service, but have at times suffered from the weather. The Southern's problems with the wrong kind of snow and the annual curse of leaf fall are well known, but the electrified services are a vital part of the lifeblood of the nation's capital. Sometimes rail is the only way to travel. Some parts of the Southern have not been electrified. A number of diesel units, based on the electric units, were introduced in the 1950s to work on the unelectrified services in Hampshire and Sussex. British Rail gradually reduced the gaps by electrifying routes such as Southampton to Portsmouth, Oxted to East Grinstead, and Tunbridge to Hastings. Suburban electric units worked further and further out into the country, until such places as Southampton, Bournemouth, and even Weymouth became commuter towns. The non-electrified main line of the former Southern Railway was to be the West of England main line, downgraded in the 1960s on its transfer to the Western region. After a long period of secondary status with cascaded locomotives such as the Class 50s, in the 1980s it was transferred to Network South East. NSE proceeded to modify and update the railway, culminating in the introduction of new Class 159 units in the early 1990s. The 1990s were to see the final chapter in the British Railway story. For the railways of the South, this meant big changes. The creation of Network South East in the mid-1980s had given the railways of the South a distinct identity once again, and the South-Western Division of NSE was one of the first to be offered for privatisation. The other major feature of the 1990s in the South was the opening of the Channel Tunnel in 1994. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, this provided the railways with very heavy freight traffic, as stone and other construction materials were transported to the southeast. Construction trains for the Channel Tunnel had seen the introduction of the first privately owned locomotives to work on British Rail in the 1980s. These were the Class 59 diesels from the United States, operated by the Somersetshire Quarrying Company of Foster Yeoman. The old South Eastern Main Line was to be upgraded to serve the Channel Tunnel, and in 1994, a private consortium proposed to rebuild the old Great Central Main Line from Rugby southwards to London, and going around the west side of the city to use new tracks alongside the original South Eastern Line from Redhill to the tunnel mouth at Folkestone. Our programme ends as yet another part of the story starts. This was the first train to emerge from the Channel Tunnel from France. In 1994, services from Great Britain to the continent would commence, and Britain was no longer an island. The commuter and holiday lines of the south would be the main route to Europe.